So, America's top diplomat, Antony Blinken, arrives Abuja, meeting Nigerian officials, including President Buhari and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Jeffrey Onyama, and delivering a speech on U.S.-Africa policy. Mr. Blinken's trip marks the highest profile visit yet by a Biden administration official to the continent. It comes as the international community is faced with what UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has described as an epidemic of military coups in Africa, and amid a rapidly spiraling conflict in Ethiopia and a series of continuing terror threats in the Lake Chad Basin and the Sahel region, all of them fueling major humanitarian crises across the continent. So, against this backdrop, are we any clearer on how Mr. Blinken intends to address America's foreign policy objectives in Africa?
Deeply concerned is Ethiopia. The conflict there threatens not just that country, but its neighbors as well. I very much appreciate President Kenyatta's engagement on this, including at the United Nations and in person in Ethiopia. We're working closely with Kenya, the African Union, and its High Representative for the Horn of Africa, former Nigerian President Obasanjo, as well as other partners. Our Special Envoy, Jeff Feltman, is working with High Representative Obasanjo to press the parties to end hostilities immediately and without preconditions, to stop human rights abuses and violations, to provide humanitarian access for the millions in northern Ethiopia who are in dire need of life-saving supplies.
Antony Blinken there speaking ahead of his arrival in Nigeria. Well, for greater clarity on the Biden administration's Africa policy, I'm joined now on the line from New York by Michelle Gavin, Senior Fellow for Africa Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you very much indeed, Michelle, for joining us. So just tell us more about what you understand the agenda of Mr. Blinken's visits to Africa to be.
Certainly, and thank you so much for inviting me to join you. I think that one of the real challenges for Secretary Blinken is that the agenda is actually so full. There are a set of peace and security issues that have to be addressed, as we just heard him discuss in the Horn of Africa, but of course in the Sahel and Nigeria itself, there are the important global issues that cannot be addressed without African buy-in and support, including climate change and addressing pandemic disease. And we're still coping with pretty appalling vaccine inequity. And then there's this sort of forward-looking agenda around economic development and partnership, strengthening those ties, particularly with the sunset of AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which has largely governed trade relations between the U.S. and the continent. And then finally, President Biden's strong emphasis since he came to office on support for democratic governance and trying to kind of reinvigorate a coalition of countries that believe in democratic principles, civil and political rights, and a rules-based international order. So that's a lot on the agenda, and I think the real challenge is going to be prioritizing so that these meetings can be as effective as possible.
Yes, thanks very much indeed for setting that out. And beyond the specifics of Blinken's visit to Africa, in terms of the things that he's going to be doing while he's here, one of the big expectations is that he's going to set out President Biden's Africa policy. With regard to that, what do you think is going to be, in terms of the broad strokes of it, what it'll contain?
Well, I hope that it will pivot away from the Trump administration's emphasis on major power rivalry, right? I hope that it will not frame U.S.-Africa policy in the context of competition with China. Obviously, China is an incredibly influential power globally and an important actor in African affairs. But my hope is that what the Biden administration will be aiming to do is sort of reset and emphasize the areas of shared interests and values where the U.S. and African states can be working together. And I think that, that gets at the democracy agenda, but it also speaks to the importance of moving forward in a realistic and productive way on important issues of prosperity and issues of justice. And, in order to execute that successfully, the U.S. is going to have to find ways to bring African equities, African priorities sort of further up in the decision-making process so that we can move forward in a partnership that's about kind of building the international order we want to see together, not trying to convince African states to join one team or the other.
Well, just listening to you there, it sounds as though your expectation is that the Biden government will be much more involved in the continent than the Trump administration.
Well, I certainly hope so. It's very difficult to see how the Biden agenda, with these big global issues on their plate, can be effectively pursued without strong partnership in Africa. So I do think, it's a positive signal that the Secretary of State is on the ground, having done a virtual visit earlier. We're all sort of constrained by the realities of the global pandemic, of course. And, I just think that the will is absolutely there to deepen and broaden ties. The execution is the hard part, and it's unfortunate that so many of President Biden's important diplomatic nominees for the continent are still held up in the Congress. So there are kind of structural issues in the U.S. that can make it sometimes difficult to move out with the kind of speed and expertise one might like. But I am optimistic that this team understands that the U.S. future is inextricably tied to Africa's future, and that means making Africa a foreign policy priority.
That's a very good point you made there, because I think oftentimes on the continent the expectations are, perhaps a little bit too much. But obviously the Biden government involved in matters of peace and security, and seemingly keen on furthering some of the initiatives started by previous administrations. There's been a lot of talk about Power Africa, for instance, which was an initiative of President Obama to try and expand the availability of electricity on the continent. There's also talk of green energy and climate change. I mean, do you expect all that to figure in the Biden Africa policy?
It absolutely has to. When we look at the priorities of our partners, certainly addressing energy poverty is at the top of the list for many African states, and for very good reason. And so as we grapple with these climate issues, it's important to acknowledge that African states are still struggling with this issue of access to power, and that the solutions that make sense are not going to be the same as the solutions that make sense for countries like the U.S. that have been major emitters for a very long time. So I absolutely think that, the Power Africa program can be an incredibly important tool in that regard, and that some of the other, legacy programs from President George W. Bush's PEPFAR, which addresses HIV/AIDS and has been a very, very successful U.S. initiative. There's no reason to sort of jettison the infrastructure that exists to engage. What's important is to make sure that it's updated, it's reformed in ways that can help it both bolster the Biden agenda and respond to the needs of our African partners.
I expect people will also be keen to hear what he has to say about trade with Africa. You mentioned AGOA, because Africa, of course, still a very small trade partner of the US, accounting for less than 2% of US external trade, and that is dominated by, previously at least, by oil exports from Nigeria and Angola. What do you think the thinking is about increasing trade with Africa?
Well, I know that this is a subject of a serious review within the administration because there are big decisions to be made, and you're absolutely right. It's clear that our efforts thus far have sometimes led to some anemic results. So I think that my hope is that part of this engagement in President Biden's first year in office is involving a lot of listening to our African partners about what it's really going to take to make our trade relationships more robust, to serve both parties better. And I do think that, a part of this is some work we need to do within the United States to help the U.S. private sector better understand, better navigate, and more realistically assess risk in African markets.
And you mentioned earlier the Trump administration's policy being to counter China in Africa. Africa, of course, where the average age is 19, is often seen as the region of the future. So, I mean, it seems almost inevitable that superpowers will focus more on Africa and how they can benefit from that relationship with the continent, aren't we? And we've got about 30 seconds.
You couldn't be more accurate. It makes perfect sense that major powers all around the world are aware of the vast potential of African societies, of Africa's heft in global institutions when it's united, right? And the fact that Africa has a great deal to contribute to major global governance challenges. So I think, acknowledging that that's the case, rather than framing everything in some kind of binary competition, leads to a lot more productive dialogue.
Michelle, I want to thank you very much indeed. Very enlightening talking with you there. Michelle Gavin is a Senior Fellow for Africa Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations.